Hello everyone, my name is Ben and welcome back to PASSTHEauxCORD, a channel where it is in fact all a simulation, and today we're going to be taking a really close look at the band Muse by ranking and reviewing every project they've put out. On this channel we have a pretty long and beloved history with the band. I've reacted to most of their biggest projects and some of even their slightly lesser known ones at this point. And while I was away for a while, I was kind of contemplating if I wanted to finish that out and react to the rest of their albums, and I have decided that's not in fact going to be the case. But today we are still going to be wrapping everything up with this band by reviewing and ranking all of their albums. I'm going to be ranking them classic tier list style after I get done talking about each one, and I thought just to add a nice little twist on it all already, I'm also going to be ranking every song on the album. That part won't necessarily have any commentary, I just want to give you all a little list. So now that we know how it's gonna go, let's get into it. Let's start with a surprisingly humble beginning, back to a 5-day period in the autumn of 1997 with the Muse EP. The Muse EP was released on the 11th of May the next year with a 999 copy run under Danger Records, after the owner of the label, Dennis Smith, was impressed with their live performance. This 4-track EP is something essentially only important for the lore of the band, as it includes songs that would later be remastered and released. Showbiz later contained remastered versions of Overdue, Cave, which would become a single, and Escape, leaving only Coma, which would become a B-side to the aforementioned Cave. Starting it off, you have one of the most uncharacteristically grunge-sounding Muse songs with Overdue, something that would spell totally different things for the band later. The backing vocals may well feel a bit more robotic, but everything else is way more raw and rough around the edges, more drum-heavy here for sure as well. There's also a totally different instrumental bridge leading into the chorus where the song ends on Showbiz. They cut out some lyrics in this part as well, and I think that they might have been cut out because they weren't the best look, but that's just a personal theory. That, and of course the fact that this version of the song feels longer than it needs to be, so the trimmed version does feel a lot more clean and concise. Cave, however, was only shortened by a few seconds, but still massively varies in structure, this one including a piano-bass instrumental send-out rather than a guitar solo as the album version would include. The sound here is a little bit more traditional rock leaning as well. The guitar motifs take much more of a spotlight on this version, and there's less emphasis on the drums and vocals, with significantly less effects, if any at all. Coma is easily the most similar track to its remastered variant, and this was likely less polished up later because it did end up being a B-side rather than an album track. This one sounds just slightly more rough around the edges, but that's about it. This isn't one of their most notable songs to me though, personally, and it does lean a lot on some of the generic tropes of the time. To close it off, we get an earlier version of Escape. Not a ton has changed with Escape, but there is a huge difference in mixing that makes it feel totally different. My opinion on this project is fairly obvious overall. It really is not essential when most of it exists and is better sounding on their later catalog. If you do happen to wear out any of these songs in their album version for yourself though, it's probably a nice way to refresh it. Matt Bellamy has came out and said before that this project was mostly just released to get their name out there, and it's pretty clear as to why that is. Now that I've talked about something relatively insignificant, I'm going to be placing it at an E tier because it's completely inessential listening. However, it does hold importance to the band's history. Something even more lesser known in the band's discography is the EP that then followed, called Muscle Museum EP. And the title track of this EP, Muscle Museum, would also later land on Showbiz. This is another EP released under Dennis Smith's Danger Records as well, and had the same size producer backing the band. This one is 2 tracks longer than the previous EP, but 4 of the 6 end up the same way, landing on their debut Showbiz. This does spell out certain things for the consistency of Showbiz that would follow later, as 8 of the 13 Showbiz songs on that entire track listing are already released, but we'll get get to that later. The ones we see on that album are the title track Muscle Museum, Sober, Uno, and Unintended. Muscle Museum remains essentially the same, but the vocals are a little louder here and there's 2 more seconds of outro. Sober is damn near identical, but if I'm not wrong, there's a slightly different tone coming from the guitars here. At this point, there's maybe an interlude. I found this, I don't know, I'll link it. I have no idea if it's official, because when I can find official track lists of the Muscle Museum EP, they don't seem to include this more oftentimes than not, but I did find a playlist and it seems like it fits here. It's very Muse sounding, so this interlude may or may not exist. Uno sounds cleaner in the studio, but bassier in the EP. Then again, that could just be YouTube compression doing me dirty. And Unintended has more spacey, almost dreamier vocals and a lot more compression on the EP from what I can tell. The only reason I give these changes so much note on here is that I think it's really interesting to see how the self-titled EP has so many obvious and notable changes, whereas this one almost entirely mirrors the full release editions. This shows that they're starting to have a lot more confidence in their sound and their ability to produce the music that they want to, which is good, and also they have the right to at this point, as this project sounds a lot better than the EP before it. The last 2 tracks on here are actually unique to this particular project. One by the name of Instant Messenger that was never remastered to my knowledge, and another by the name of Muscle Museum 2, obviously a track connected to the original Muscle Museum. Instant Messenger is a quirky little tune about having a long-distance relationship, and this song has aged like milk given how far internet communication has come, but I still enjoy it quite a bit for what it is. As an American, the sample is really funny to me as well, after hearing mail instead of post so many times.
You've got post.
And closing the EP off is an alternate version of Muscle Museum, which is really odd when compared to the original, but is actually totally worth checking out. It has more of a Latin flair to parts of the instrumental, and has these quick cascading drums that just go throughout the whole thing. Totally uncharacteristic of them for especially this time period in their career, but it's still really cool. So for the most part, this isn't worth coming back to, since the studio versions of 4 of the 6 exist elsewhere, but I see this as a nice piece of insight into their progression, and the 2 unique songs are worth hearing too, so it is worth putting at a D tier as it showed a lot of progression. The year 1999 is still upon us, the same year that Muscle Museum EP came out, and Muse has found the time right to release their debut album, Showbiz. This had a much more professional industry backing behind it, with 4 different record labels releasing this in different countries and regions, as well as 2 producers working alongside the band. This landed them some relative success for someone just getting started, hitting 29 on the UK charts at time of release, giving new validation to the lyrics of Muscle Museum. The album did only contain a sum of 5 new tracks altogether, meaning that a lot of it was recycled content, some of it even being tossed around as early as 1996, and it really shows with how all over the place Showbiz feels. Their influences range massively, spanning Latin to classical to Western, as well as a little more of the rock cliches, making for an again inconsistent release. I also find that a downside of Showbiz is the fact that despite having much higher production budget and a record label backing with more industry importance, the actual sound of the record is a bit unprofessional. I can't help but feel like the mixing and production is a little gutless and too clean and polished. Given this is what would become Muse's most hard rock leaning project, it would have been really nice to see some production that matches that grit. On the other hand though, this does include what is objectively speaking the best versions of all of their best songs so far, even if I do like a little bit of a rougher recording at times. And the songs that they did put together only for Showbiz and were original at this time are definitely worth a listen, including the amazing title track. On the other songs, Sunburn isn't one of their most interesting tracks, although it is a good tone setter, and Philip ends up being one of my least favorites, with the most tedious 4.5 minutes, unfortunately. Outside of that though, you have the slow and emotive Falling Down, which is Definitely one of the best. It stands out on its own really well. Then there's the double finale with Hate This and I Love You and Spiral Static, which does bring a satisfying conclusion to a very all over the place listen. What they did show on here is a lot of inconsistency, I'll reiterate that again, but it also showed even more of their technical skill and their potential to make some really great music. Much of their proficiency as musicians were shown off very well here and had been at the point in which we're at in their catalog. I think Showbiz would be a lot more great if it had a completely new, fresh track list and took on a little bit less clean and gutless production. But it still definitely has a lot of moments that are really nice and definitely worth coming back. They have great songs on here that still hold up, and a lot of them a lot of people like better than I do as well. So I'm going to be placing this at a C tier to show a pretty steady progression to this point. In this moment in their career, Muse had more than solidified their name, and they needed to come out with something great. They had seen some success, but they needed to drop something that would have them remembered forever. Clearly, the most pivotal moment in their career, its random 1 through 8 EP. In actuality, I debated not including this one at all, but I guess we did have the 2 EPs before it, did include those, gotta include this, it's just kind of how it's gotta work at this point. This EP saw a very low-key release only in Japan where they were touring at the time, likely to familiarize people of Japan with their music so they'd want to come see them live. The songs on here were all live performances and B-sides, which makes sense as this would be all new content if you had only purchased their album. Host and Coma were Cave B-sides, Pink Ego Box was a Muscle Museum B-side, Agitated and Forced In were Uno B-side, and Yes Please was a Sunburn B-side. Yes Please and Forced In were also on the Hullabaloo Soundtrack 2 years later, which is interesting. That is except for the 3 hidden tracks on this CD. You can tell what year we're working with because there's hidden tracks on the CD. These are all remixes of Sunburn, which is an odd choice, but cool, I guess. They aren't particularly notable, but it's a neat little bonus, I guess. And I also found it kind of interesting that most of them are a little bit hard to find at this point, actually. But what I really want to know is this technically random 1 through 11? Something to think about. This was a very brief promotional release, and because of that, it's hardly worth ranking it at all, and it hardly seems fair to, but it does have some of their best B-sides and it has some alright live performances as well. I also like the quirkiness of the hidden tracks. I guess we'll just slap it at a C because why not? Now, all jokes aside, in the year 2001, they would release what has become probably their most beloved project to this very day. And it set them apart from their influences and pioneered their space rock trademark sound. This album is called Origin of Symmetry, and it is really a shining star in the Muse discography, a sight to behold, certainly. Stunning vocal performances, catchy hooks, heavy riffs, climactic solos, it's the whole package to pair up with their futuristic aesthetic. There's so many dramatic moments instrumentally that pop up throughout the album, such as the explosive and gritty tuned riffs on hyper music, paired up with some of the only Muse scream vocals. It also makes you realize why there's not very many scream vocals in Muse songs. Or the Megalomania instrumental in its entirety, ranging from dark and brooding to orchestral and triumphant. There's also the ominous opener to this album, Newborn, that sets the mood with some sparkling and dramatic keys and soaring vocals. After moments like this, you'd never expect their cover of Feeling Good, which I think they did a very good job with. They really matched the song with their aesthetic and made it their own while keeping much of the charm and charisma of the original track. It also fits well into the overarching concepts to this album, especially the themes of it. It ties in quite nicely, and I think that this is definitely one of my favorite cover song placements in an album. And you did hear me right, there is somewhat of a concept running through all of these tracks. The writing is done incredibly well. I think Matt Bellamy is really in rare form, providing especially especially great takes on every topic covered. That's not to say that his writing is usually terrible or anything, but this is certainly a lot of his biggest standout moments as a lyricist. Origin of Symmetry's lyrics revolve much around the venting of negative emotions, mental health, and broken relationships. The catch, the gimmick maybe, is that it all has this boldly sci-fi and dystopian tone behind it. For example, the term space dementia being used to describe a disconnect between two people because one of them has seemed to change. Or how Citizen Erase seems to be about losing touch with yourself and the outside world, but the naming of the track is so industrial and cold. There's exceptions to the rule, of course, too, like what actually ends up being my favorite on the LP, Plug-in Baby. It's my favorite here not only for the amazing riffs and killer chorus, but also the lyricism of the track that has remained somewhat shrouded in mystery. Bellamy has given many explanations of what the song is about through the years. One of the first ones he gave, so possibly the most reliable, is speaking on themes of futuristic technology, resonating on a lot of the same things that you would expect given the concept of the album. He's also answered that it's about a sex shop. He's also answered that it's about a Glade air freshener. So I don't know that we can necessarily take his word for it at this point. I personally really like the theory of this song being written to his electric guitar, and the whole song is about falling back on music to be there for you. All in all, Origin took Muse from being some upcoming band that sounded way too much like Radiohead with some sloppy engineering to a beloved and unique rock band with an interesting and fresh sound. While they never have escaped the Radiohead comparison stigma entirely, most people who still bitch about that to this day will even admit Origin of Symmetry is really their own project. Critics even agreed for the most part, as quoted from Q magazine, comparisons with Radiohead that dogged Muse's early career now seem all but obsolete. The only largely critical reception to this album that I had seen among publications at the time of its release is with The Guardian, and they have never had a good opinion about anything, further solidifying this at its S tier rank. Next up, in the year 2002, Muse served up what was really their most enigmatic release yet, the Hullabaloo Soundtrack. Hullabaloo is not a soundtrack like most soundtracks would be for a movie or a TV show or a video game, something to that degree. No, this is a soundtrack to their live performance in Les Zéniths, Paris. Now, this is also broken up into two different discs. Disc 1 being a B-sides compilation, and Disc 2 being an actual recording of that live performance. This is a little confusing already, as the B-sides don't have much to do with the Paris live performance at all, but is made more confusing by the fact that the live disc only partially shares a track list with the actual performance. During the performance itself, they performed the 20 tracks shown here, and they have 11 tracks on the disc that do somewhat mimic the order they played them in, but there are 9 songs that are completely missing. I don't really know why they opted to do it that way rather than just including the whole thing on the CD, but to make it even more confusing, the Japanese version is different entirely. Starting with the B-sides disc, the order of the tracks is entirely switched around, showing no similarities whatsoever. I can't imagine why that is, but it is. And the only other difference is that the standard contains Forced In, while the exclusively Japanese edition includes Jimmy Kane instead. And to add further differentiation, Sunburn is included on the Japanese live disc, but is excluded from the standard release. Confused yet? Me too. All in all, I think this comp is pretty cool just because a lot of bands I've found have so many buried B-sides, and it's really nice to see this many in one spot. The live performance is fantastic, as always with Muse. There's a reason everyone cites Muse as a great live band, and that's because they certainly are. I can most definitely say that I hope one day to see them in a live setting just because of how great their live performances are. And the actual Hullabaloo video does further make me want to see them in person. The energy is just all there. While an incredibly confusing choice of packaging to put this all in, with so many complications, especially between editions, this is a really cool comp that I like a lot, both for the live side of it, which is really well performed, and all of the B-sides. The B-sides including, I would say, all of their best B-sides, but some of their best songs in general. Map of Your Head is such a good Muse track, and it's kind of a shame it never landed on a real Muse album. The other ones I can pretty much say the same for as well. Every track is actually really solid here, and I can see why they wanted to release it in a more official capacity. Of course, you cannot deny the greatness of a Muse live performance, so that certainly brings my opinion of the whole thing up even further, past just really liking the B-sides. Even if it is slightly less than necessary and really confusing, Hullabaloo definitely gets a really solid beat here from me, and one that I was tempting to even jack up a spot. We're 3 years into the 21st century and Muse is at a huge high point. They have a massive and dedicated fan base at this point in time already, and they just had a great tour with a great album to back it. It's said that on the next album they worked on, Absolution, there was a lot more communication in between the band members, and it was more well planned and thought out than anything they had released prior. It is also true that there is an even more professional label backing, with this being the first record for Muse to release under A&E Records. Rather than corner themselves into one sound, the band further developed more styles and seemed to use many more influences than seen previously in their sound, now having notes of hard prog and symphonic rock. Here you have some really hard rocking tunes like the singles Hysteria with its infamous heavy riff, and Stockholm Syndrome, arguably the heaviest Muse song in their entire discography. Dramatically different are some of the most melancholic and peaceful moments, such as the beautifully arranged Butterflies and Hurricanes, or the crushingly potent Thoughts of a Dying Atheist. While this kind of variety keeps it fresh and makes it so the album has something for everyone, it just feels like a better version of Showbiz post-listen because of the inconsistency. It's certainly a lot to take in at one time, and covers so many genres, styles, and entirely different aesthetics throughout the entire thing. But despite all that, it does feel narratively and sonically conclusive by the time you're done with it. The lyrical themes from Absolution have a darker mood than the previous record and the previous one before that, keeping a very dystopian feel but having an even stronger apocalyptic tone. Absolution ties back to its name, with the actual word absolution referring to an often Christian sentiment of ending a punishment and completing forgiveness for it. Here it seems like the focus is that the world ends and dying with it are all of the negative things about it, hence the forgiveness portion. I really enjoy the concept driven behind Absolution lyrically. Stockholm Syndrome and Hysteria are about those very mental illnesses and does a great job to simulate them through the song's sonic presentation. Another amazing track is The Small Print, which is about selling your soul. At times it makes the listener feel like your soul has sort of ascended away from you. And I'll make another mention towards Thoughts of a Dying Atheist. You can tell how heavy this song is in its tone just by the name alone. I think the moments where Absolution struggles, though, is when it is seeming like it's trying to become an apocalyptic concept album rather than just covering on different concepts. Fittingly, the opener Apocalypse Please just kind of bores me a little bit, I guess. It doesn't really get me in the right setting for it. Sing for Absolution and Endlessly also do make me feel this way. Really, the only other weak link is Ruled by Secrecy, which is a conspiracy theory driven song, and that would spell out things for their next release lyrically as well. The song just seems to drag a lot, and the lyrical concepts seem a little bit too outlandish. Everything else on here, though, solid gold. This has some of Muse's best tracks undeniably, including the track Matt Bellamy wanted to be the closer, Fury, which was added as a digital bonus track and a regular song on the Japanese version. I'm with Bellamy here. I really like the way that Fury wraps up the apocalyptic concept, and it does it really well. While I really love so much that they put on Absolution, it does have its occasional skip. That's why I was only able to toy with the idea of giving it an S tier before knocking it down to an A. Almost everything on here is 100% worth your time, and it does live up in most ways to Origin of Symmetry before it. Riding the high of Absolution for 3 years, which is 2 times longer than their last pause, Muse came back with a game changer of a record on Black Holes and Revelations. It's also important to remember that the last gap was accompanied by the Hullabaloo Soundtrack in between albums, so this is by far the biggest gap in between releases they've had since their 1988 inception. A very significant thing about this release as well is that it reached a huge worldwide spectacle for the first time in their career, and this would continue to happen to this day. It set them onto a fling of incredibly successful LPs and especially singles. This landed at number 9 on the Billboard charts, an entire 98 places higher than its predecessor. It also was the first Muse album to go number 1 anywhere, and it landed that way in a pretty significant 7 countries. Considering every Muse album after landed in the top 10 on almost every chart, this is clearly the start of their astronomical success. But why was that? Of course, there's an element of the right time and the right place, as there is in any music ever that pops off like Muse did, but a lot more than that contributed here. Muse had now seen 2 successful albums that weren't necessarily mainstream hits, but gained them recognition and notoriety in many circles. They also gave them a fairly large fan base that would be willing to spread the band's music by word of mouth. If there's one thing a Muse fan likes to talk about, it's Muse. And given there was 3 years in between releases here, that means that all of the Muse fans would have plenty of time to have shown both of their friends the band's music. That's a joke, but in reality, that 3-year gap did make everyone who had heard of the band's music so far very eager to get that brand new Muse CD in their hands. At this point, they did only have 3 full-length LPs to replay after all. Past that though, most of it had to do with the new sound they adopted here, taking their trademark space rock aesthetic from Origin of Symmetry and fleshing it out even more. This music feels like accessible pop rock almost all the way through, but accessible pop rock that feels like it exists on a rocket-headed Mars. This album holds what still to this day are the 2nd and 3rd hottest tracks on Muse's Spotify, for what it's worth, I guess. And they sum up nearly 500 million streams between the two, which is pretty impressive for something that came out pre-streaming. Both were obviously singles, and very successful ones at that. It's clear to see why when hearing the songs. These are punchy, accessible tunes with a catchy and likable personality and a presence you can play anywhere, much like most pop music. Matt even went on record as saying going to New York dance clubs influenced the sound of Supermassive Black Hole with hints of funk and electronica. This also introduced the world to Muse's intergalactic style, going back to sci-fi titles paired with earthly problems and emotions, Supermassive Black Hole being a song that compares that very thing to an attractive person, of all things. And Starlight being a pretty traditional love song, but with some space-based aesthetics, lyricism, and phrasing. Supermassive Black Hole also featured in the Twilight soundtrack later, oddly enough, giving a little bit more life to it even to this day. That movie was a pretty huge cultural phenomena, if you can remember back that far, so that certainly is a lot of the reason why it became the popular song that it is today, so that added more life to the song 2 years after its release. The sound of Black Holes and Revelations in general was very funky, danceable, and combined a lot of accessible elements in a way that was pretty unique to them. There are many sore thumbs in the track list though too, even with that in mind. Assassin being a pretty hard rocking tune, almost poking at the sound of Stockholm Syndrome. This leads to a string of tunes differentiating from the formula entirely, with Exopolitics being another fairly hard hitting tune, leading into the climactic City of Delusion that also oddly features a Latin guitar opening. Pretty much the second time they ever did that, and one of them was a very hard to find song being Muscle Museum 2. Hoodoo is the slow burner of the album with a huge build up to a dramatic finish. Knights of Sidonia is the standard edition closer and one of the coolest Muse songs out there, no question about it. This 6-minute saga takes much homage to earlier rock sounds that influenced Muse, and feels like a journey through its soaring instrumental and dramatic heights and climactic presentation. Knights of Sidonia would then become the third single from Black Holes and Revelations, and has released legendary status in the Muse discography. It's really transcended that entirely as well in some ways, being a futuristic but classically inspired rock ballad for the ages. Also interesting is what Knights of Sidonia does to relate to the themes of the album. The single cover for it is a horse, which you can also hear galloping through the intro of the song, which ties to the cover where there are tiny little horses running around the table. These so cute little horses. Outside of that being pretty adorable, the common interpretation is that this represents the four horsemen of the apocalypse, a common tale of the end of days, with there being four men controlling these little horses. This obviously ties into the apocalyptic themes of Absolution before it, interestingly. However, the writing of Black Holes leans much more political. This could contribute to how official and leader-like these four men are. Now it ties back together in that a big theme is corrupt world leaders bringing about Armageddon. These four horsemen look like leaders and politicians, meaning that the leaders of the world are the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Or maybe I'm just stretching a lot and I'm just off about some stupid bullshit. I don't know. All things considered, Muse tried a ton of new things stylistically and lyrically on Black Holes and Revelations, and most of all brought their space rock jams to a far wider audience. Whether you prefer its futuristic and fun tracks or its heavier tinfoil hat tunes, this record is a pretty enjoyable listen all throughout. That being said, it spelled success, but not necessarily quality for the band's further output, as they may have dipped their toes too far in the deep end of radio pop rock music. Some of the songs here, including the biggest hit on the album, do feel really fun in the moment, but leave a little bit to be desired outside of that initial buzz. That's not limited to that song, and it's even more prominent on songs like Invincible and Map of the Problematic. Problematic. That in combination with the fact that I'm not a huge fan of Matt Bellamy's conspiracy theorist side of writing, I'm gonna place this at a B tier. It's an incredibly significant B tier, but I do prefer it much less to Absolution and Origin of Symmetry. Muse would then stick to their once successful formula of releasing a studio LP once every 3 years, except this time in between releases, we saw HAARP, a live album. Name of this is shared with a government program where they did some sci-fi shit over in Alaska. They had the stage all put together so it looked like the HAARP, which is cool as fuck. This was their live performance in Wembley Stadium, and if you didn't notice yet, Muse is killer live, so of course such a big performance would be no exception, especially considering it would be recorded and released. This is one, if not really the only live performance I'd say is essential listening from a band. This shit really goes. Everybody loves this record. NME even gave it number 40 on the greatest live albums of all time. Even Pitchfork was messing with it, and they fucking hate Muse. So really all there is to say about it, shitbangs. It's worth seeing the whole performance on the DVD release rather than the CD digital version. If not for the visuals, then for the 7 tracks you'd be missing out on though. Weird putting a non-album release at anything above a B tier, but here I am placing it at the A. While on top of the world, Muse seemed to have decided that 3-year gaps, much like most bands, were a great time period gap in between albums. And coming in 2009 is the first of very popular but very divisive albums by the band, this one being The Resistance. Here they took their space rock style and mixed it with a stunningly large amount of Queen influence, making much of it feel a bit vintage. Immediately opening up is the most popular Muse song there likely ever will be, in the form of Uprising, setting the tone nicely. This track to me feels like a nice pick back up moment after Knights of Sidonia, being another fairly spacey and cinematic rock ballad with a lot of length to the runtime. Being their biggest hit, I feel like I should have more to say about it, but that's pretty much the vibe here. I mean, There's not a lot else to say. It's a pretty great track. It is also the reason why so many people compared Queen to the band on this LP, and also the reason so many people heard it at all, with this track being the lead single and an instant hit. This much fueled by the track's mass appeal quality in sound, and the fact that after Supermassive Black Hole, Muse was a staple mainstream band and somewhat of a household name. After this one though, I have to say it's a little all over the place in terms of quality control. Resistance paired with Uprising really gives you the picture of the album's protagonist that you need, lyrically speaking, with it being about a rebel force against a totalitarian government. However, Resistance, to me at least, holds up really no point in the album other than that, as it sounds like they just did Uprising immediately after doing Uprising, but did it worse. From here forth, it follows the aforementioned loose concept, much of what's talked on here being very resistance against the power flavored. It has its moments for sure, like the dramatic United States of Eurasia, based on an actual novel, because Bellamy's a fucking nerd. MK Ultra is a pretty good song in this vein as well, even though you've already lost me because I had to sit through the foot-draggingly, unbearably long, unnatural selection. That brings us to the key problem that has plagued a lot of their music since as early as Showbiz. The songs are just too damn long. The slight concept deviations are the love songs here. I Belong to You, where I really do like Matt's French singing and it makes it a good song, even though it does drag a bit, and Guiding Light, which ends up being my favorite here with its sound intentionally reminiscent of early and pretty corny arena rock. This song gives a nostalgic and fun quality they haven't tried to this point, making for a unique and memorable track. The saving grace is that all of the hit-or-miss mediocrity is placed before the beautiful Exogenesis Symphony Parts 1 through 3. These are 3 tracks that fit the same sound palette but focus much more on orchestral elements and are mostly instrumental. They are beautifully arranged and really make the album worth hearing in my eyes. The Resistance overall feels to be a somewhat sloppy and misguided project to me when compared to how Black Holes took the same amount of differences and made it feel interesting and innovative instead. There are too many songs here that brood and drag and just do not want to cut to the chase at all. That's certainly not to say there's no diamonds in the rough though. The handful of tracks that I mentioned positively surprisingly make up half of the album, and I do come back to those fairly regularly. This is the first time though that a Muse project looks like almost as many skips as plays when I look at the entire track listing, landing it at a C. 3 years pass again, and we have what almost feels like a companion piece to the Resistance with The Second Law. And much to my surprise, The Second Law feels like a great case of don't judge a book by its cover. The Second Law is certainly a flawed release. It leads off the narrative of a resistance in an Orwellian society and ends up adding a ton of extra cheesiness to the tray in the process. In sound, it's just as corny as well, incorporating a lot of the popular styles at the time, including the poorly aged dubstep genre straight out of Skrillex's bag of tricks. Its length also goes head to head with its all too long predecessor. All in all, it shouldn't be good. It shouldn't be good at all. It should be dull as a box of rocks and poorly aged. But I'll be damned if this does not have some of their most undeniable bops of their entire career. Kicking this album off is the very dystopian novel-themed Supremacy that adds to the running narrative. Instantly caught me off guard just how much I like the dramatic moments of this track. It's a super enjoyable jam. And here we find ourselves at one of the most popular Muse songs that I didn't even know was by them, Madness. I ended up going through a huge nostalgia trip when listening to this massively intergalactic, space-based, romance-themed track. It's incredibly catchy and has some of the best notes of production of that era. Very much a product of its time from what I can remember of popular music at the time, but it's definitely one of my favorites out of the ones I've revisited through the years. All throughout going forward, you have much in this vein, with some massive movie trailer type tunes that make me feel legitimately empowered and immersed most of the time. When looking at it this way though, I do notice a pretty strong front-loadedness for the first time in their career, unfortunately, with almost all of the weakest tracks in the third quarter. Animals is a solid politician-hating anthem, but that leads all too well into a bit of a dip, with the pretty bland, slow Explorers. But that is then justified immediately with the fairly hard-hitting Big Freeze. But we do see another valley, even if a little less steep, on Save Me, which didn't stand out to me quite as much. But again, rising up, it's instantly justified with Liquid State, a very solid, rigid track to become the semi-closer. The reason I say semi-closer is because this album does a somewhat similar thing to the Exogenesis Symphony, in that there's a huge, mostly instrumental portion that comes after all of the traditional songs you see on the first part of the album. This time, however, rather than a gorgeous orchestral saga, we see two almost fully dubstep bass tracks. An odd choice, but honestly a welcome one. We hear narration about some nerdy shit, I guess, very cool, Matt, chopped up and skewed into wubs, wobbles, and bass drops over a bouncing but triumphant electronic rock beat. I have no idea how these songs felt at the time. I wasn't into music anywhere near as much, and I was quite young. Now, though, these make me smile and think of a simpler time. It reminds me of a simpler time when you'd plug things in to charge them and the plug would look like this, and then it would be attached to this sketchy device. And on this sketchy device, you'd have a lot of tracks by Skrillex and probably like one or two intros from YouTubers that you really like. These last two songs seem like they wrap it up pretty solidly, though, and are really nice closers. This album as a whole definitely has skips. It has flaws, it's really cheesy, intentional or not, but it is still so lovable in its own kind of way. And that's probably not something you'd hear from somebody who's not right around my age. Nostalgia does play a bit of a factor into it for sure, but I still legitimately enjoy most moments on this. I can see anybody writing this off, as it is definitely one of their easiest albums to criticize, but I don't really see any need to. It's just really good for what it is. So this is not a perfect B by any means, but it's getting a B tier regardless. It seems so out of place that 3 years later, we wouldn't get a closer to this trilogy. You have the first one, you have the second law, but then that isn't followed up with anything even remotely similar. I suppose that would be a 9-year period in which they would be drawing this out, which may be a little long, but it still would have been nice to see a closer to the trilogy. And it would have been pretty interesting to see what they did with the sounds of 2012 and 2013 on an album like that. Instead of something interesting, we got drones. Dead inside. On Drones, the band saw fit to bring their sound and style back down to earth, leaving a pretty ugly crater on impact. Instead of a far more fictional battle, Drones focuses on the issues of war and a lot of times politics as well. Very worldly issues. And it doesn't necessarily put any kind of spin on it to make it feel more spacey. That has been shown to be a great thing to write about by probably hundreds of bands at this point. Taking a clear and pretty obvious influence from plenty of rock and roll from the 80s, such as Van Halen and AC/DC, this is easily the most traditional rock sound they have ever taken up, with almost no gloss and special effects. That should make it sound gritty, right? Not so much. This is pretty gutless most of the time. The problem with this kind of music, 2010s forward, is just how played out it is. AC/DC doesn't even make it sound good anymore, and they're the ones who led the style during its inception. That was also in the 60s. Instantly when breaking into this record, we have the edgily titled Dead Inside. The song introduces us to our jaded protagonist through a love song on an album about war. This leads me into a peeve I've been dying to talk on, and something they still do. Bellamy seems to want to turn everything into a love song for no goddamn reason at all. I get if you want to touch on a more emotional side, but there's really a time and place. This is a pretty solid track though sound-wise, even if setting a pretty generic tone. I like the effects, and it has a solid rhythm and some pretty sick guitars. Thereafter, a drill sergeant skit is placed that actually is setting the tone, unlike the opener, and this presents our first song focusing on war itself. Aligned with the album's thematic focus, we see the introduction of the first butt rock tune in the Muse discography, with some generic riffs and awkward lyrics that sound very off in Bellamy's tone of voice. There's such painfully obvious Marilyn Manson influence on the hook here, you'd swear it was a guest feature. They sound much more like Marilyn Manson on this track than they ever once sounded like Radiohead in the past. Then the most confusing tonal shift in an album sound I've ever seen happened with the almost synth pop follow-up Mercy. Unlike their previous poppier tracks that take a much more elegant tone though, this one incorporates many chuggy radio rock riffs, but that's not the real problem here. Why the fuck does this sound like a closer when we're 4 tracks into the album? They have just barely introduced the war concept and already skipped straight to the closer by the sounds of it, focusing on thoughts of peace outweighing war. I'd be way easier on this admittedly enjoyable track, but its tacky resolution fits nowhere near the beginning of an album. Reaper plays at this point, but is essentially just Psycho, but way too long and with an okay guitar solo. I really don't get anything out of this one, and it all puts me to sleep, despite how awake the big riffs want me to be. Then I can say that for the entirety of this bloating, dragging record from here forth. Almost all of the music from the band engages me, or keeps me wanting more at the very least. Drones kept me waiting for something original somewhere in it, but it fails to provide. Much like this album felt like it was closing with track 4, this happens 3 more times throughout the track listing. The first with the melodramatic track Defector, and Revolt back to back with it. Only one song passes until we reach another false stop on the excruciating lengthy track Globalist. Only finally on the actual closer do we feel a bit of redemption for a respectable 3-minute a cappella tune as the title track. It's the most interesting thing on this album easily, and even then it's been done so many times and done better at that. This in general feels like a huge misstep in their catalog and makes me second guess my criticisms of the statement of Muse being too derivative, as Drones is the definition of derivative. Everything on this LP has been done and done better by a myriad of bands spanning 4 decades back. They just don't bring a single new thing to the table despite their innovative past. Silver linings, although scarce, do exist for this record, however, it has its moments. There's some riffs I really dig, a couple good solos, and I'm always happy to hear Matt's voice over anything, really. He does still sound good here. The whole album is pretty hard not to, tap along with, though, I have to say as well, even if it is in a really boring background music kind of way. It just has some really solid rhythms. This isn't necessarily related to the album itself at all, but they had a great tour following this album up and in promotion of it as well. A tour that was much better than the album itself, and these live performances would have been great to see. I mean, they really went all out with it. I've even heard, and I don't know if this is confirmed or not, that they actually didn't make any money from this tour because of how much they ended up spending on the production side of these shows, including many props and a really elaborate stage presence. They did take it to a whole new level here, and they are really good live to begin with. Because of those vague positives, it does escape the depths of the F tier, although just barely. Making this an E tier, I'll give it that little bit of a benefit.
Hey everyone, so post-production Ben up in the stew here. So I kind of retract my statements here because while indeed good, there was a pretty damn big flaw with one of these props, including the drone blimp they tried to use in one of these performances, crashing into the crowd. This could have probably killed people. It didn't, though. Everybody was okay, thankfully, but can you imagine if this prop at least seriously injured someone? I mean, that would be pretty ridiculous. But outside of that entirely, this also degrades the quality of the other media surrounding the album itself, mostly in terms of there not being cool music videos like there was on their previous album. The Second Law had some absolute cinematic masterpieces of music videos. However, on here we just see, a couple, but it mostly reverted back to these corny music lyric videos that I've been showing a couple times throughout the course of this portion, I suppose, of the entire review. And this just reminds me of all of the generic rock bands that are still doing sounds like this today. They also go and make lyric videos in this fashion. Not great stuff. So even these redeeming qualities that I did mention at the end here, outside of the actual sound of the album, it's not necessarily making up for anything. So I'm actually going to go ahead and bump this down a notch all the way to the F tier, because I'm just less sympathetic towards it now.
Becoming tradition at this point, another 3-year gap passes for the band, including much touring in between. And then we saw the release of their most recent record, Simulation Theory. I feel like at this point in their career, Muse is pretty stuck between a rock and a hard place as far as reception of their sound goes. They were criticized for the EDM and dubstep influences on The Second Law because it was poppier and different, so they had to just make rock music at that point to avoid those criticisms. Then they see rightful criticism for being too generic, as that's the first time, even in my eyes, they completely were when they released Drones. So what do they do now? What I think they did is do exactly what they wanted to and finally stick to their guns and make that third album in the growing trilogy that was going on for the decade before it. Simulation Theory is a dip far more into the electronic music side of things, relying on a lot of effects, synths, punchy drums, and highly polished and produced sounds. My view on them taking this sound back up is rather unsurprising. It sounds amazing on my ears, and that's what's important. A massive problem with the rock music scene is that if you aren't painting by the numbers, you're called a greedy sellout. Muse pioneered what is really almost a genre of their own. Trying to pull Muse back into a painfully Earth-like place is what selling out really is in their context. You wouldn't take the space and special effects away from Star Wars, and I feel like such is true with Muse. When I heard this record for the first time, I had just listened through their entire catalog, and it just felt like such a breath of fresh air to see them embracing a lot of their styles from the earlier points in their career, and then mixing it with some contemporary sounds of this time. So all of that completely aside, how is the album? Well, much of why I said this finally felt like part 3 to the saga is that this shares so many traits with The Second Law, the good and the bad. I said it then on that album, and I'll say it now, this is a flawed project, but it's one I really end up enjoying. Much like our past 2 entries, Simulation Theory is taking the perspective of a person in a futuristic era resisting a higher authority. Simulation Theory, if you're unfamiliar, as a term refers to the idea that life as we know it is simply a simulation controlled by an outside force. This leads to lyricism and sound, as you may expect. While we do see much focusing on that concept, as well as some things stemming off it, like overall totalitarian resistance, much like many albums in the past. The first 2 tracks really focus on both, with the sentiment seeming to be overthrowing the creator of the universe. So that's pretty rad. But more interestingly, focus is sometimes given to the separation of man and machine. The album's back cover seems to demonstrate that concept quite nicely. The track Something Human relies on that heavily and ends up lyrically being my favorite track on the album. I feel like they picked the right aesthetics for this as well, most of it resonating in the realm of what they picked up on The Resistance, especially the undeniable Queen influence and other arena rock traits of that time period. I also hear a little Michael Jackson here and there, but maybe I'm tripping, I don't know. All of it is very modernized as well, which does make some of the dramatic moments unfortunately feel oversold and almost a little Imagine Dragons-like. I wouldn't say that though without the sickeningly sweet Get Up and Fight though, and the song before it, Thought Contagion, with its oversimplistic hook, despite really enjoying the song personally. Most of the tracks here are loud, bombastic, and triumphant battle cries with a synthetic and poppy attitude that works though. Many big ascending moments, catchy hooks, polished but punchy instrumentals, everything you'd expect. I cannot stress to you enough that this is fun to listen to, period. I feel like you can just agree with that on an objective sense if you aren't looking at this album with any sense of pretension in mind. The songs are never long, never too boring, always catchy, and always make it really easy to have a good time. However, the problems do come in when you start focusing on the legitimacy of it. They certainly embrace some cheaty tactics like the whoa whoa vocals on a couple tracks, over explosive choruses, and even over simplistic song structures. There's also the argument, fairly well deserving, that it is slightly derivative. Far less than Drones before it, but still legitimate nonetheless. Pretentious people don't really dig it when something sounds anything like what's popular at the time though, and I think that heavily influenced the mid-tier, kind of iffy response to this album upon dropping, and the mixed opinions it still has. I'm not a guy who's really too big on caring about that sort of thing, and I think that styles get popular for a reason. It's because they're very enjoyable to listen to most of the time. And for that reason, I really like the way this sounds. It just sounds really nice. The only big negative of this LP to me is that it is a bit front-loaded. Most of the best songs are on the front end, even though you wouldn't ever listen to this album not finishing it just because of how conclusive the ending of it is. I still love most of those tracks on the later end though, which makes it nothing short of a B tier for me, and one that is almost touching the A tier even. And that's all we really got for you on this one. That does cover the entire discography to my knowledge, spanning over the last couple decades. It's a journey I can definitely recommend to everyone, as you're probably going to find at least something you love. You're probably going to find something you hate too, but that's just kind of the beauty of it. Here's one last look at the tier list itself, and that's all. I hope you guys all enjoyed this very deep dive into Muse's discography, and if you do, let me know in the comments below, and let me know another band you would like to see me do this with. And I do really appreciate you staying to the end here. So drop a like on the video if you did like what you saw today, and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content coming your way. Hit the bell for notifications on that same thing as well. But that is just about going to wrap it up for this one, and I will see you in the next video.